AITA, for telling my daughter that her mom cheated on me after she said, "My new girlfriend looks like an OnlyFans girl." I told her the truth, and her reaction shocked me more than I expected. I never thought a single comment from my daughter could shake me the way it did. Skylar has always been the one closest to me, the child who shared her secrets with me, the one who trusted me more than anyone else. But the moment I introduced her to Lisa, something changed in her eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't try to talk. She didn't even pretend to be polite. She sat stiff, arms folded, as if being in the same room was uncomfortable for her. Meanwhile, my son Nick was laughing with Lisa, asking her questions, and treating her as if he had known her for years. Watching the two of them react so differently created a strange tension inside me, but I brushed it aside. I thought maybe Skylar just needed time. Later that evening, when the house was quiet and I was cleaning up the living room, Skylar walked in with a look that didn't feel like my daughter at all. Her face carried irritation and something colder judgment. She didn't hesitate. She didn't soften her tone. She didn't think before speaking. She simply told me that Lisa looked like an OnlyFans chick. The words hit harder than I expected, not because of the insult itself, but because it came from her, a girl who never talked like that, who always stood up for women, who never repeated cheap gossip. Hearing something so harsh from someone so gentle felt wrong. It felt like the anger wasn't hers, like the words didn't belong to her. I tried to stay calm, but the truth I had carried alone for years suddenly felt too heavy to keep inside. Skylar had grown up believing I was the villain of the divorce, believing her mother had been hurt by me, believing I had moved on too quickly. So when she insulted Lisa, it wasn't just about Lisa, it was about everything she thought she knew. And I couldn't let that false picture continue to shape her. So I told her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound angry. I simply explained that her mother, Emily, had been the one who cheated. Not once, but multiple times. That the marriage ended because of betrayal, not because I stopped loving my family. And that Lisa came into my life long after the divorce. The moment I said it, Skylar's entire expression changed. The anger vanished, replaced by a stunned silence. She didn't argue, didn't question, didn't cry. She only whispered a small, quiet "oh," and then walked away. That single word kept echoing in my mind long after she left the room. I sat alone on the sofa, wondering whether I did the right thing or whether I had just broken something inside her that she wasn't ready to face. The house felt heavier that night, as if the truth itself was filling every corner. But the next morning, I realized that Skylar hadn't been the only one affected, because Emily, my ex-wife, showed up at my door furious, defensive, and ready for a confrontation I knew was coming sooner or later. And from that moment, everything began to unravel even faster than before. The next morning started with a kind of heaviness I couldn't shake off. The house was unnaturally quiet, as if Skylar's silence from the night before had seeped into the walls. I kept replaying the moment she whispered "oh," wondering what she must have felt. Confusion, betrayal, anger, or maybe all of them at once. I was still lost in those thoughts when the doorbell rang, sharp and impatient, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I knew immediately who it would be, and I was right. Emily was standing on my doorstep, her arms crossed tightly, her face filled with the same defensive fury I had seen years ago during the last days of our marriage. She didn't wait to be invited in. She marched past me as if she still lived there, turned around, and demanded to know why I had told Skylar lies about the past. She spoke quickly, aggressively, accusing me of trying to poison our daughter against her, calling me cruel for bringing up old wounds. She insisted that I had implied I would keep her affair a secret, as if silence had ever been a promise. The way she framed everything made it clear she wasn't actually angry about the truth. She was angry that the truth had finally reached someone she couldn't manipulate. It wasn't about protecting Skylar. It was about protecting her image. Standing there, listening to her twist the situation, something inside me finally settled. For years I had carried the guilt of keeping her infidelity hidden, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I wanted to protect my kids from the pain of knowing who their mother really was. I didn't want them to grow up with bitterness. I didn't want them to blame themselves or question why our family fell apart. But as Emily kept talking, I realized that the lie I had protected them with was now being used against me. Skylar had insulted Lisa not out of her own judgment, but because she had been fed a version of the story where I was the villain. When I told Emily I never promised her anything, she went silent for a moment. A rare moment of stillness. She wasn't expecting resistance from me. She was used to me taking the blame, absorbing the chaos, trying to keep the peace. But I wasn't the same man she left behind years ago. And I wasn't willing to let her continue shaping our daughter's mind with half-truths and convenient narratives. I told her that Skylar deserved honesty, not stories built to make her mother look better. Emily's face tightened at that. She didn't shout. Instead, she took a deep breath, looked away, and muttered that I had ruined everything. After she left, the house felt even quieter than before. But it wasn't an empty silence this time. It was a heavy one, filled with truth, finally exposed. I sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the message notification on my phone from Skylar. She was in her room, just a few steps away from me. Yet emotionally, she felt miles distant. Her message was long, honest, and heartbreakingly raw. She admitted that the harsh things she said about Lisa weren't her own thoughts. They were words planted by Emily, and her aunt whispered judgments repeated until they felt like truth. Reading her message, I realized she wasn't angry at me at all. She was angry at her mother. Angry for being misled. Angry for being used emotionally. She apologized for repeating something so cruel, saying she felt ashamed. She said she wasn't ready to talk face to face yet because she was afraid she might break down crying. She needed time. But she made it clear she didn't blame me, and that alone lifted a weight from my chest I didn't know I was still carrying. I didn't reply right away. I knew she needed space, not pressure. But for the first time since the divorce, I felt hope that the truth was finally reaching where it needed to go, and that maybe, just maybe, the bond between us could heal from the years of misunderstanding. The next few days were quiet, almost painfully so. Skylar stayed in her room, shutting the world out, and I gave her the space she clearly needed. I didn't want to force a conversation, didn't want to push her into facing emotions she wasn't ready for. But that didn't mean I could stop thinking about her, or stop feeling the tension between us. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled sound from her room made me pause, wondering if she was angry, sad, or just confused. It was a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that she hadn't lashed out at me, and anxiety over the emotional storm I knew she was weathering alone. I kept my phone close, half expecting another long message. And then, one evening, it came. Skylar had written pages, not hastily, not in anger, but slowly, with thought and care. She admitted that she had misunderstood everything about our family's past. She confessed that she had assumed I was the one who had betrayed her mother, that she had believed the lies fed to her for years. Reading her words was both crushing and healing. Crushing because I realized how much she had carried unknowingly, and healing because she finally recognized the truth, and it was the truth I had always wanted her to know. Her message also revealed her pain. She explained that she had felt trapped between loyalty to her mother and her own emerging understanding of right and wrong. She had repeated awful things about Lisa because she thought that's what was expected of her, because she didn't know who to trust anymore. Her honesty was like a mirror held up to our family, reflecting all the fractures, the misplaced anger, and the quiet despair that had grown since the divorce. Yet, through every word, I could feel a spark of maturity, a new clarity beginning to take shape in her mind. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I simply read and reread her message, absorbing her emotions, feeling her remorse, and acknowledging her courage. She wasn't ready to face me yet, and I didn't want to rush her. I understood, maybe for the first time, how painful it must be for a child to confront the truth about a parent's betrayal, to see the person they loved not as flawless but as human, flawed, hurt, and still capable of love. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. There was a long road ahead, but for the first time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Skylar wasn't angry at me, She wasn't rejecting me. She was processing, learning, and slowly beginning to separate the lies she had been told from the truth she now had. And that truth, I realized, was the most powerful thing I could ever give her. A few days passed, and the tension in the house began to shift ever so slightly. Skylar still stayed mostly in her room, but the long, heartfelt message she had sent lingered in the air, like an unspoken bridge between us. I found myself walking past her door, pausing to listen, wondering if she was reading, crying, or just thinking. Every time I passed, I felt a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that she would finally confront the truth of our past. Fear that she might still reject the reality I had tried to protect her from for so long. But slowly, I began to notice small signs. The soft hum of music escaping her door, the faint smell of her tea brewing in the kitchen, little traces that told me she was still here, still present, still connected. That evening, I decided to leave a note for her on her desk, a simple message that didn't demand a response. Take your time. I'm here whenever you're ready. Love, Dad. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone in this. The message felt like sending a lifeline across a stormy sea, letting her know that even if she was overwhelmed, she could come back to safety whenever she needed. That night, I barely slept, imagining all the emotions she must be going through: anger, betrayal, sadness, and perhaps even a quiet relief at finally knowing the truth. The next morning, I noticed her sitting at the kitchen table, quietly drinking tea, the note still in front of her. She didn't look up as I walked in, but I sensed a shift in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a fragile acknowledgement that she was beginning to process, to accept, to consider, seeing me not just as the parent who had endured betrayal, but as the parent who had been honest with her, who had chosen truth over comfort. The bond we had shared for so long, though shaken, wasn't broken. It was just waiting to be repaired, piece by piece, word by word. Later that day, Skylar sent me a short message. I'm ready to talk soon, but not today. I just needed to breathe. That one sentence carried more weight than any argument, any insult, any confrontation. It told me that she was thinking, reflecting, and most importantly, choosing to process things in her own way. And in that choice, I saw a strength I had always admired in her, a quiet courage that had grown despite the confusion, the lies, and the emotional turmoil. For the first time since the divorce, I felt a flicker of hope that our family could begin to heal. I didn't know when the full conversation would happen, or how long it would take, but I understood that healing wasn't about rushing. It was about patience, understanding, and letting Skylar find her own way to forgive, accept, and reconnect. And as I looked around the quiet house, I realized that even in the aftermath of betrayal, even in the shadow of pain, there was still room for love, for honesty, and for the first steps of reconciliation. The days that followed were quiet but heavy with unspoken emotions. Skylar stayed in her room most of the time, yet I could sense a subtle change in the air whenever I walked past her door. The long message she had written lingered in my mind, reminding me that she was processing everything in her own way. I could almost feel her thinking, untangling the threads of truth from the lies that had been spun around her for years. It was exhausting for both of us, yet I knew that this silence was necessary, that healing often required patience more than words. Skylar began observing Lisa differently as well. At first, she had dismissed her with harsh judgment, influenced by whispers and assumptions, but slowly, she started noticing the small things: Lisa's kindness, her willingness to listen, her sense of humor that filled the house with warmth. Lisa wasn't just my girlfriend. She was someone who reminded me of hope and happiness after years of pain. And seeing Skylar begin to recognize that, without me pushing her, felt like a quiet victory. I realized that trust, once broken, couldn't be forced. It had to be earned slowly, with gentle persistence and visible care. One evening, Skylar left a short note on the kitchen counter. She didn't want to talk yet, but she acknowledged what she had seen and felt. She admitted she had been repeating things she didn't fully believe, and that she was starting to see people for who they really were. Reading those words, I felt a relief I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't complete reconciliation, but it was a crack in the wall that had been built between us, a sign that the truth was finally beginning to take root in her understanding. I spent that night reflecting on everything: the divorce, the betrayal, the misunderstandings, and the long path that had brought us here. I realized that the hardest part of parenthood wasn't keeping children safe from harm, but teaching them to see truth clearly, even when it hurt. Skylar was learning that now. She was learning that judging someone without knowing their story could lead to unnecessary pain. And she was starting to see the strength it took to love again after betrayal. And for the first time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, our family could begin to rebuild itself. Slowly, carefully, and with honesty guiding each step. The following week, the house carried a different kind of tension, one that wasn't loud or explosive, but quiet, anticipatory, and heavy with emotion. Skylar remained mostly in her room, but there was a change in her presence. She was slower to retreat into silence, lingering a little longer in common spaces, sometimes watching Lisa and me interact with a curiosity that felt almost cautious. I could sense that she was preparing herself mentally, piecing together her thoughts before she would finally confront the feelings that had been building for so long. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about understanding the people around her and deciding where she stood in the tangled web of family and truth. I noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She would pause mid-task, staring into the distance as if weighing words in her mind. She asked questions, quietly, not directed at me, but to herself or to Lisa, small inquiries about how people handle betrayal, forgiveness, and moving on. It was clear she was thinking, not just reacting. The anger and judgment had softened, replaced with a quiet, deliberate contemplation. I watched her from across the room and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because she was finally opening her mind to understanding, apprehension because I knew the moment of truth was approaching, the face-to-face conversation that would test both her patience and mine. Meanwhile, Emily's presence loomed in the background, a constant reminder that the past wasn't fully behind us. She hadn't stopped trying to manipulate, sending indirect messages, subtle jabs meant to unsettle both Skylar and me. I had learned to tune most of it out, but Skylar hadn't, and I could see that the tension between them was weighing on her. She wasn't angry at me, that had been made clear, but the residue of her mother's influence still lingered in her emotions. It was delicate, precarious, and required careful navigation. That evening, Skylar sent another message, short but significant. She was ready to talk, but not just yet. She needed to feel steady, to gather her thoughts, and to approach the conversation on her own terms. Reading that, I felt a mixture of pride and patience. She was no longer a child blindly absorbing the opinions of others. She was becoming her own person, capable of discernment, reflection, and even forgiveness. And I knew that when the day came for her to finally speak face to face, it would be a turning point not just for our family, but for her understanding of truth, loyalty, and love. I spent the rest of the night quietly, reflecting on the journey so far. The betrayal, the misunderstandings, the harsh words, and the long silences had all led us to this fragile, delicate moment. But for the first time in years, I could see a path forward. The road to healing wouldn't be simple, but Skylar was readying herself to take the first real step, and I would be there, patiently, to meet her when she was ready to cross that threshold. The day finally came when Skylar felt ready to speak face to face. She had been quiet all morning, moving slowly through the house, her eyes distant yet focused. There was no rush, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet, deliberate approach to something she had been carrying for years. I stayed calm, trying not to fill the air with tension, reminding myself that she needed this conversation to happen on her terms. When she entered the living room, she didn't immediately look at me. Instead, she walked to the window, hands resting lightly on the sill, taking a deep breath as if gathering all the courage she could muster. I could see the mixture of emotions on her face, lingering anger, confusion, fear, but also a subtle hint of determination. We sat down together, and she began to speak slowly, carefully. She admitted that for years she had misunderstood everything about our family, that she had believed lies fed to her by her mother, and even by people close to us. She told me she had assumed I was the one who had betrayed Emily, that she had judged Lisa unfairly based on what she had heard rather than what she had seen. Listening to her, I felt both the weight of the past and the hope for the future. Each word she spoke was a step toward understanding, a step toward reclaiming the bond that had been strained by miscommunication, betrayal, and assumption. Skylar confessed that she had been ashamed of the things she had repeated about Lisa. She admitted that she had been influenced, manipulated even, by whispers from Emily and her aunt, and that she regretted letting their words shape her perspective. It was a difficult, emotional moment, and I could see tears threatening to fall as she spoke, though she held them back with quiet strength. The honesty in her voice, the vulnerability, and the courage it took to finally confront these emotions filled the room with a sense of healing, fragile, tentative, but real. As she continued, Skylar spoke of forgiveness, not in grand, sweeping statements, but in quiet, honest recognition. She expressed that while she couldn't erase the past, she could see me for who I truly was, a father who had endured betrayal, who had chosen honesty over comfort, and who had loved her without condition. She acknowledged Lisa as a positive presence, someone who brought light and laughter back into my life. Hearing her say these words, I felt a mix of relief and pride, realizing that Skylar had grown through the experience, finding clarity and strength within herself. And though the conversation was not yet over, the hardest step had been taken. The truth had been seen, acknowledged, and accepted. After that face-to-face conversation, the house felt lighter, almost as if a weight had been lifted from every corner. Skylar didn't need to speak constantly. Her presence alone carried a quiet reassurance. She had seen the truth, acknowledged it, and begun processing it in her own way. The bond between us, once strained by misunderstanding and the shadows of betrayal, felt like it was finally being mended. There were still lingering memories of the past, and moments when emotions threatened to surface, but now they existed alongside understanding, rather than as barriers. Skylar began spending more time outside her room, quietly observing Lisa and me interact, and slowly participating in conversations. It wasn't immediate closeness, but subtle gestures, a smile here, a soft laugh there that told me she was starting to accept the positive changes in our family. Lisa, too, handled it delicately, never forcing interaction, never seeking approval, simply letting her warmth and patience speak for themselves. Over time, Skylar began to see her as more than just my girlfriend. She saw her as a person, a friend even, someone who had become part of our lives in a meaningful, honest way. Emily's influence, which had once loomed so large, began to fade in Skylar's perspective. The subtle manipulations, the whispers meant to confuse and control, no longer held power. Skylar had learned to separate truth from distortion, to judge for herself, and to choose where her loyalty lay. Though Emily still lingered on the periphery of our lives, the hold she once had over Skylar had weakened, replaced by her daughter's own discernment and strength. By the end of that week, the household had begun to feel like a home again. Skylar came to me voluntarily, sitting beside me on the sofa, sharing small pieces of her day, asking questions about life, and even laughing at some of Lisa's jokes. The tension had softened, replaced by understanding, connection, and the beginnings of trust that had been damaged for too long. I realized that while the past couldn't be changed, the present could be nurtured, and the future could be built on honesty, patience, and love. Sitting quietly that night, I reflected on the journey, the betrayal, the anger, the messages, the silences, and the eventual confrontation. I understood that the hardest moments had been necessary, that the pain had carved the space for truth and reconciliation. And as I watched Skylar finally relax, a small smile forming on her face, I knew we were moving forward together, stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the possibility of happiness again, a family, imperfect but resilient, finally learning to heal. Thanks for listening to the story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support really helps me share more stories like this. See you in the next one.